Welcome back. We are about to begin the first of two plenary panels. Everything today is plenary in any case, so we're going to begin our first panel. The panels dovetail nicely one with the other. The first one is going to talk about how realistic is it for us to even think about doing this work? What does it take now in the changing world that we're in of social media, Google, Amazon, the changing role of traditional portals such as print, as newspapers, and of bricks and mortar bookstores and other forms that have been the basis for the dissemination of the kind of narrative nonfiction that we're accustomed to. Even the change of how magazines get to the public, the role of the Kindle and the iPad, all of those things, the fact that we're now expected to tweet in addition to work on these monumental 10-year projects. After all of that, condensing it to 140 characters, 200,000 words to 140 characters. How do we do that? We have a compilation here, a gathering of people from different vantage points of what it takes to get narrative nonfiction to the public. We have, starting at the beginning, with Ken Auletta, a longtime New Yorker writer since 1997. He had also been a writer for The Village Voice. He is one of the best-known names in the work that we do. He's a writer of 11 books. He's done this 11 times. The manic depressive cycle of beginning, finally finishing, and getting it out to the world, and then having the courage to do it again. He has sat on multiple boards, among them the Livingston Prize, which is an important one for beginning journalists. And he is someone who is going to give us a sense of what it takes to make the change from all of the processes, from the writing of it in the traditional form and then translating that into the current one. And your book, Googled, is a perfect example of that. So I think he's perfect for that. We also have Jill Abramson, who's going to continue from the editor's perspective. Again, we need friends in high places, and it's good to have someone so committed to the work as Jill. We also have Hampton Sides, who is the author of multiple books, including his latest, Hellhound on His Trail, and who has been an editor-at-large at Outside Magazine as well, has written for multiple magazines, among them Vanity Fair and Esquire. I will be speaking about also the perspective from that manic depressive state that one has to enter, that cave, and what it takes. And we are so pleased to have Amanda Urban, who is one of the most influential agents in the country, and whom I know will be mobbed after we're done. The prime portal to getting narrative nonfiction to the public means an agent. She has been an agent with ICM and has represented almost every big name in this field, many of the big names in this field, from Toni Morrison to, let me make sure I have the list straight, because I want to make sure I include everybody. Richard Ford, Cormac McCarthy, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Anna Quinlan, John Meacham, Dexter Filkins, James B. Stewart, who has a new book out. In addition to, those are the journalists and the people who have done nonfiction. In addition to E.L. Doctorow, Nora Ephron, Mary Carr, Michael Pollan, and so many others. So we're honored to have Amanda Urban here to help us understand what we have to do in order to get past the many portals in that way. And then finally, we have John Stauffer, who brings to us multiple ways of looking at this. He's a scholar. He understands and deconstructs what we do in a way that has great meaning, because he is a critic. He is a critic. Finally, once you have done all this, you then have to begin the work of it going out in the public, and it has to get past him. Very important person. He is a professor at Harvard. He has multiple roles. He's both a professor of English and of history, if that's correct, history, which means he brings multiple dimensions to understanding the work that we do. He also is the author himself, so he's been through the process. You know, he actually has done what he is critiquing, and he is most notably, I'm recalling his book Giants, which is about the interaction and interdependence in some way, the friendship and connection between Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And so this panel will be exploring these issues, and I'm going to throw these issues out and then see where it takes us. The main issues are considering the obstacles and the challenges that we're facing in this world of narrative nonfiction, as well as whatever the reasons of optimism there might be for moving forward, and I think there are many reasons for optimism. What is it that we need to know as people who want to do this kind of work, are doing this kind of work, are thinking of doing this kind of work? What do we need to know as we go forward? How can we truly make a living at doing this kind of work? Probably the most important question of the day. And what is working and what is not working in the industry right now? And so I'm going to start alphabetically. I'm sure, Ken, you're accustomed to this. Anybody whose last name begins with A is accustomed to this, I think.
I spent about 3 years doing a book on Google, and one of the things I learned, and it was a book about not just Google and who they are and how they think, but how they've impacted, how they in the digital world have impacted traditional media. And one of the things I learned as I look back over the last 15 or so years of traditional media is that, generally speaking, and I'm generalizing, but most newspapers, most magazines, most book publishers, most telephone companies, most software companies, most music companies, most advertising agencies made the same mistake. They leaned back, they saw this revolution taking place, digital revolution, and they leaned back and they said, oh, woe is me. These terrible things. Microsoft is evil Microsoft, evil Google, evil Apple, whatever. And instead of creating online newsrooms, yes, they had online newsrooms a dozen years ago, but they were run by the newspaper editor, and you couldn't break a story until it appeared the next morning in the newspaper, in most cases. And you look at the music business, they insisted on you had to buy an entire CD, you couldn't buy singles. Well, along comes iTunes in 2002, and suddenly for 99 cents you can buy a single. Not only could you buy a single, but you can sample it for 25 seconds, free. You can listen to that song and decide, do you want to purchase it or not? And what you saw at a place like Google, what I saw, is you had engineers who were always asking that question, same question, which is why not? Why not sell individual records? Why not have Google News and make it digitally available for everyone for free? You know, why not have cloud computing, and so don't pay $400 for Microsoft packaged software, get it much cheaper in the cloud from Google, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things you learn from that, or at least I take away from that, is don't make the mistake that traditional media in general made. Not everyone did, but many did, of leaning back, being a pessimist, saying, oh, woe is me. Lean in the way those Google engineers do and be an optimist. Wake up every day. I could sit here and tell you 10 reasons why I could be pessimistic about the future. I could also give you 10 reasons why I should be optimistic. But I don't want to wake up every day being a pessimist. Jill?
Well, I think I expressed my optimism in my earlier remarks, so I think I'm going to move into the question that Isabel posed, which is the compelling one of, how either you as writers support yourselves doing this, but I think I'll take a first cut at how the New York Times actually into the future supports this kind of journalism and the journalists who make it. And it's why, in the past month, we have gone to a subscription model online, something that for the past 3 years, like every publication and newspaper has agonized over endlessly, trying to study whether there is a workable business model for journalism in the digital age. And the Times is really, I mean, the Journal and the FT and a couple of other premium business publications have been able to charge for content online, mainly because in the case of the Journal or the FT, traders and other people in business need the content for work. And because it's a business niche, they were able to find paying readers. No real general interest publication had made a big go of it by charging online, but among my colleagues, just in the newsroom, going all the way on up to the publisher, Arthur Sulzberger Jr., starting about 2 to 3 years ago, when the doomsayers were really out in force. And every conference I was invited to speak at was about the death of journalism. It was very depressing. That was the most popular topic. Sentiment really, grew. It wasn't only sentiment. It was like the people on the business side of the Times also thought it was smart business to not just accept the mantra that news wants to be free, and to say, when you're the New York Times and you're producing the very best kind of singular reporting, writing, witnessing, that it isn't unreasonable to ask readers to pay for that experience. And we felt optimistic that they would pay. The model that we picked wasn't to put up, an iron absolute gate or a paywall. We have what we call a metered model, where you get to read X amount. It's 20 articles a month for free. If you come to our website from other links, from something that you might have seen on the Huffington Post or elsewhere, you can still read that piece of content and you won't be asked to pay a subscription. But what we decided is, there is a large group of Times loyalists out there. For the print newspaper, which still brings in the lion's share of our revenues, there are over 800,000 people who have subscribed to the Times home delivery for 2 years or more. At that point, they're pretty much addicted to the thing. They're not going to drop off. And when you think that a print subscription to the newspaper costs more than $700 a year, that's a lot of money indeed. So in print, we've always had these loyalists. Well, it turns out, as we mature digitally, that we're approaching having a loyal audience on the web too. So what we designed is geared towards asking our habitual readers, the readers who are actually reading more than 20 full articles a month. I know that may sound like little amount of content to you, but the average print reader spends about 40 minutes a day reading the New York Times in print. And online, I hate to tell you, it's 40 minutes a month. So that gives you a point of comparison. So actually setting the meter at 20 articles is aimed at our heavier readers, and that's the audience that we're trying to begin to establish, not only an advertising stream of revenue to support our future, but something approaching a circulation stream as well. And so far, lots of people are signing up. It's going better than we had expected it. which is very good news indeed for the future, I think. But that is one way that I'm optimistic that we're going to continue at the Times to support the creation of the kind of journalism we're talking about.
Hampton, how do we make a living at this?
Well, one interesting paradigm for how this could work is something that happened last week. How many of you followed the Greg Mortensen story? Most of you in the room at least have a passing awareness of it. It was just a giant shitstorm, basically, allegation and innuendo and character assassination, and there's so many implications, ethical and in terms of moral, fiduciary implications fall out from this thing. But one of the things that hasn't been talked about too much, except among some industry insiders, is how this thing that John Krakauer wrote is kind of a new creation. This thing called byliner, which is
I talked about.
Oh, did you in the first one? Yeah. Well, it really is. It is an interesting idea that as a way to subsidize some long-form journalism, people who don't necessarily have a full-blown book idea yet, but want to gestate something, somebody perhaps who has an expose, something that has a shelf life, something that has to happen quickly. I think it'll be very interesting to see how this does. In the first week and a half or so, I don't know how much money they've made, but I mean, 20,000 downloads or something. It's what is this? A nonfiction novella? Is it of course, the other idea is that these things will become multimedia, and there will be all sorts of links embedded in this text, whatever this thing is. This is one way, I think, that some forms of long-form journalism will see the light of day, and people will make money off of it. I mean, editors, websites, and the writers themselves. So I think that's one thing. In a way, I'm old school, though. I'm a historian. I write books, and I like people to buy the hardback, preferably. And I much prefer, personally, the smell of a book and the feel of a book, and I like the smell of the glue and the binding, and I'm a Luddite in that way. And I think most of us in this room probably still prefer to read that way. And I don't think that books will ever. I mean, there'll always be books. There'll always be readers of books. They may have to pay a lot more money for them. It might become more of a boutique kind of thing, where if you really want a nice hardback book, you're going to have to pay $50 for good ink, good stock, well designed, good photographs, and that just may be the reality.
As a Luddite, an admitted Luddite, how has it changed your approach to a narrative as you go about your work, would you say?
Well, one thing that is true is that so much, and this is a good thing, so much research that a historian has to do can now be done at home, that going to the archives, while still very, very important, is not nearly as important as it used to be. You can do a lot. I tend to write in a coffee shop in Santa Fe. I just go and stay for 12 hours. I have an account. I have a plaque over a chair that everyone knows is mine. And people say, how can you write history from a coffee shop? And it's because, so much of it is now digitized in some way, fashion, some way, shape, or form. And so a lot of the trends in terms of just how we pull together material are going in our favor. So that's good.
That's a great
well, you
thing.
mentioned 10 things, 10 positive things. I would like to know what the 10 are, but maybe that's one of them.
Maybe we can come up with 10 before we're done.
Yeah.
It will come from the audience as well as ourselves. Amanda Urban.
I can be positive about the book world, believe it or not.
Oh, we're saved after all.
Well, there's a lot of people writing books because as the journalism field has gotten squeezed down in terms of employment, a lot of people are looking to write books these days. One piece of good news is for all of you is that in the last decade, really post 9/11, the craving for narrative nonfiction became huge. You can get Americans to buy books on subjects we could not get them to buy books on more than 10 years ago. I mean, I love walking through airports and seeing women reading books on the war in Afghanistan. I just do, you know. So that's really good. As I say, nonfiction's at a premium. Narrative nonfiction at a premium, much more than fiction. It's much harder to sell a novel today. The other good news is that last year most publishers would have to admit that they had a better year than they ever thought they were going to have. The economy was down. There was a lot of distraction last year. Never mind the fact that Borders is going out of business. The bricks and mortar business is really shaky. And they had a better year because about 30 to 35% of their sales were ebooks, which are, as agents have been saying to publishers for a long time, a lot less costly to produce. There's no paper printing, binding, there's no warehousing, there's no expensive sales forces, there's no returns. So let's be joyous. So they were all kind of like, well, so maybe publishers have been people who've been leaning back, as Ken said, instead of leaning in. I think now, finally, this has really got their attention. As for hardcover books, we're going to have hardcover books. I think what we're going to lose is the paperback. Paperback sales have fallen by the wayside because ebooks are more competitively priced. We're seeing a migration, new hardcover books, migration of readers. 30 to 35% are buying those books in ebook form, so they're paying less for those books than you would in a bookstore. On the other hand, certain kinds of hardcover books people still want to buy. The best example I can think of was when Sarah Palin's book came out and the Teddy Kennedy book came out. Teddy Kennedy's publisher made the real decision not to release an ebook at the same time, whereas Sarah Palin's publisher did release an ebook at the same time. The fact of the matter is, Sarah Palin's book sold mainly in ebook form because people wanted to buy it, download it, and delete it. Teddy Kennedy's book, however, was a book that whether they were going to read it or not, they wanted a copy on their bookshelf. So we're learning a lot about ebook sales. There are certain genres of books like romance novels, sci-fi, mysteries, what we kind of call, and I don't say this disparagingly at all, but we call kind of the Kleenex books, where there's you just read, pick it out of the box, use it, throw it away, pick it out of the box, use it, throw it away. Huge ebook sales. So that's generating a ton of revenue for the publishers. So book publishing is going to be fine. You're going to be able to walk into an independent bookstore where you're going to have people who actually know books, and you're going to say, I'm going to St. Bart's next week, and I would like to take 5 books with me, fiction, nonfiction, and they will be able to download whatever you recommend books and download those books into whatever reading device you may have with you, or sell you a hardcover book, or say, we can print on demand. You want this book in paperback? There's a print-on-demand machine in the corner. You can have that book in 7 minutes at a competitive price. So I think it's going to be fine. I think we just got to make this transition. It's going to be a little rocky, as all transitions like this are, but we're going to be fine.
Thank you. And John?
I'm also optimistic, and I'd like to focus on books. As a scholar who has come to narrative nonfiction late, I think there are two general models for writing narrative nonfiction books. One is a model in which it's a kind of groundbreaking or paradigm-shifting book, like Amanda, or like Isabel's, like a number of other people's in this room, in which there's a wholly new interpretation of a subject. So from a scholarly perspective, from a basic historical perspective, Ken's book on Google, it provides this new understanding, a new interpretation of a subject. And it's written with a literary sensibility. And those books have done extremely well. They're also taught in universities. Isabel mentioned Lucas's On Common Ground. I mean, that book is probably 30,000 copies are sold each year, I'm guessing, just in the classroom. The other model is really a synthesis of what scholars do. Most scholars are writing for themselves because of the increasing specialization and subspecialization. A scholarly monograph will sell 1,000 or 2,000 copies, and an example of a great work of synthesis is someone like Adam Hochschild's. His work, Bury the Change, is a superb synthesis on the movement to emancipate slavery in Britain, where he's borrowing from, he's reading thoroughly and extensively in the archives and in the scholarly work, and he presents it in a form of narrative nonfiction that does extremely well. Those are the two models. I should say that that writers who write narrative nonfiction are up against a certain a scholarly sensibility that perceives narrative nonfiction as less rigorous, as more popular, and many scholars will dismiss narrative nonfiction as something that is not as important as the work of scholarship. Yet, ironically, when they teach their courses, they assign narrative nonfiction because they know if they assign scholarship, their students will be bored out of their minds. So there's this really rich contradiction. And I think that narrative nonfiction actually has the potential to revitalize the humanities. I teach in the English department. I chair History of American Civilization. So my entire career as a scholar has been within the humanities. And the humanities today is under siege. There are far fewer students majoring in history, English, art history, philosophy than ever before. There's far less money in the humanities than ever before. Professors of the humanities, their salaries are less. The amount of money that goes to professors to the buildings are far less. They're under siege. If current trends continue, history, English, art history, philosophy departments, as we know them, won't exist in 30 to 40 years. And part of that is because of this inward turning to subspecialization, navel-gazing, too many scholars writing simply for each other, for an audience of 5. And narrative nonfiction has this potential to revitalize the humanities, to make it resonate, to make it relevant for people interested in learning how to acquire a voice so that they can understand themselves, so that they can ascertain their world, so that they can ultimately change their world.
Well, I feel as if we've gotten a sense of where everyone stands on general optimism, which means that you could say we're done, but we're not. We know we have a future. And I want to throw the questions out. I want to give the opportunity for all the people who have gathered here to be able to get a chance to ask questions of this varied and very rich panel that we have. I know there must be lots of them, and I want to make sure we don't run out of time for the questions that might be. So could we begin to take questions from the audience and then allow a free-form interaction?
Hi, I'm a slow learner. I just read my first Kindle single a couple of weeks ago, and it was a revelation. And what occurred to me, I want to point this one to John particularly because, well, to all the historians on the panel, I thought pamphlets. There's a huge, rich history in America, well, particularly in American politics, of pamphlets. And I thought, oh, goodness, here's the electro pamphlet of the 21st century. And, you know, you spoke to it, too, when you said there are a lot of things that are not ready for prime time or not ready for book-length publication. But I'm just particularly excited about the possibilities of short form, the various websites you mentioned. And I'm just, people have already touched on this a little bit, but particularly in the context of thinking about pamphlets reappearing as a literary form, I wonder if people would want to comment.
Well, we have them. They're called blogs. But yeah, I mean, I think that there is this sort of, you mentioned going on iTunes and not buying the full album. You just buy one single. Essentially, that kind of model could work for a lot of medium-length stuff. Like the Byliner thing, I think it's like $1.99, $2.99. It's just it's really cheap, but it's a commensurate with what kind of animal it is. I think that idea has legs and will get some traction. Yeah.
I do too, and it's a great reference historically. The field that I write on abolitionism, the pamphlet tradition in abolitionism was absolutely indispensable. In fact, I would argue, not just me, a number of other scholars would say, without the pamphlet tradition, whether it's David Walker's Appeal or Frederick Douglass's speeches that then he published as pamphlets and circulate, they become bestsellers. Without that pamphlet tradition, the end of slavery probably wouldn't have occurred either in the United States or England. That's how significant the pamphlet was. And I completely agree that the long-form narrative nonfiction is a kind of successor to that pamphlet tradition, both in its social functions, its creativity, the literary aspects, the experimental aspects of it.
Just talking to folks here already, I've seen academics, students, freelancers, all of us at various stages in our career. So my first question is, what is the panel's idea of the best sort of training for us? To start at a weekly, to start at a daily, to freelance? What has been your experience, and what has been particularly valuable about that? And part two, again, nuts and bolts, the question that Ms. Volkerson has been repeating over and over. How do we make a living doing this? How do you make a living while writing your book? How do you make a living to foster ideas, to keep writing?
When I started at the Village Voice, it used to be that people who read the Village Voice was a platform, so other editors might read it and you might get an opportunity to get a job elsewhere, and that happened to me. It's very hard to find that common entry-level platform anymore. It used to be when a young assistant at the New Yorker would say, I want to stop being an assistant, I want to go out and write. And I would say 20 years ago, go to Louisiana, go to some small paper and get a body of work, and then you can just ship it out. Your body of work today, you can blog. And there are lots of different platforms you didn't have to get your work visible. The problem is people are not reading it, so how do you get it to the attention of the people who might matter to get a job? That is really a tough issue, but that's actually one of the big issues with the internet. There's so much information out there, including books, including articles. How do you find out about it? How do you promote it? And then you go tweet and you Facebook and you link economy and all that, and that's one way to do that. How do you earn a living and do that? I turn that over to my wife.
And I don't know. I really don't know is the problem. You don't get paid to blog. And no one's figured out how to monetize all of this information. And I think that's going to be the tricky part. I even think the short form is going to be tricky because you've got short form selling for the same price as books, and whole books in some cases. How are you going to be Isabel and spend 15 years writing a book? That's scary, and I don't know the answer to that.
We got to be poor. You got to, the starving writer and the Garrett kind of idea is still going to persist. I think, it's like we shouldn't be doing this if we think we're going to make a load of money. There is money to be had, and as you work your way up and meet people and get great agents and things do happen for writers, obviously, but there's definitely a long period of time, 20 years or more, where there's it's tough going. It's really tough, and I think that we have to do this because we love it and we're passionate about it, and the money will come later.
I'd like to say that after having gone through this entire process, I mean, so much of the work is spent on the work itself. And then you realize once the work is done that actually the work has only just begun because you have to get it out to the public. And that's a whole other job, and it requires totally different skills in which you might have thought you'd had. You'd been in a cave, and then all of a sudden you're out in the Klieg lights. And I've come to the conclusion, or I feel as if part of what we're looking at is a shift in clearly the economics of how this is done. But in some ways, what we've experienced in the last few decades, where a person could they could get a degree in journalism and then get a job at a newspaper, maybe a small one, have benefits and a pension and all the things that we associate with working in the industrial 20th century is no longer the paradigm. It's no longer the reality for what we have now. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. That is the reality. In some ways, in the long history of writers were never guaranteed a pension and a salary in the same ways that we have had the opportunity to have in the golden age of journalism. And that doesn't mean that it's not still possible, but it means that we have to maybe think differently about what it is that we are and what we do. As writers, in some ways, we're more like, I've discovered, like musicians. And thinking of myself as musicians or as artists do, because this is art. The idea of elevating what we do to art, the hard work, the passion, the dedication that it takes to create what we do, means that it's different from what other people do. We're protected by the First Amendment. We've had the wonderful opportunities to be able to have many, many newspapers and magazines to work for. But because of the changing economics, we have to think differently, just as the music industry has had to think differently. And there's nothing bad about that. In fact, it creates all kinds of opportunities. So if we think of ourselves as musicians or artists, what is it that they do to continue their work? And how do they rise? How do they find a way to bring their passion to the public, feed themselves, and still create and become the people that they want to be? And I think the lessons now are looking at it in that perspective. And I find looking at it that perspective helps one to find the way that their own path to realizing whatever it is that they want to do. So for some people, it may be teaching on the side while working at night on their work. It may mean rising very early before going to their job, doing something else. This is what musicians and actors and artists have done. We've been we've had the luxury as writers to be able to have a place to go that was kind of different from what our predecessors might have done in the 19th century. And I think that we have so many more options because we have now the internet and ways to reach a public. I don't view it as a bad thing at all. I think it's an opportunity. And thinking of ourselves as artists elevates the work and helps us think differently about how we do what we do.
Part of your question involved a training component too, and I cannot emphasize enough how much I still believe basic intrepid reporting skills is like something that, even though Ken and some of the other panelists are right, is that automatic first job at the small newspaper has all but disappeared. But the demand and market for people who know how to go out and find the right sources, who are persistent, who don't let closed doors discourage them or no email reply discourage them, that I can just see that right now, in terms of me as managing editor worrying about like who in our newsroom might be vulnerable to being plucked off. Not all that many journalists leave the Times once they get there, but it does happen. And right now, the places who are coming after some of our best journalists, who are the ones who get the biggest scoops and do, reporting like nobody else, or who are fantastic writers. It's places that would surprise you that want these people the most. It's, Bloomberg, for instance, is going from, have done very well doing basically smart, high-end commodity news for a sophisticated business audience. They now are trying to grow beyond their core and get people who write marvelous narratives and, report the hell out of them. Huffington Post, which, in my remarks, I said mostly built an audience of snackers who love the combination of little news scooplets and gossip and celebrity news and whatever. They've come after some of our longer form investigative type reporters because even though it is, as I said earlier, expensive, they want to attract the best kind of readership to their sites. They want to grow their audiences, and in order to do that, they're attracted to enterprise reporting and enterprise writing, and you can't really do that kind of work by just endlessly scraping things off the internet. You have to know how to do shoe leather reporting, and there's no substitute for it.
I'm a huge fan of Mary Carr, but she has such an unusual kind of model because she writes. She has a beautiful voice, and I guess that's her selling point. But if you think about her memoirs, they're not things that are fantastic stories or unusual events. And I was just hoping you could speak a little bit about selling a story that is based on the strength of a voice and of a personal vision versus something that is a fantastic story that might garner interest just based on the story alone.
Well, I don't know about Mary. I think anybody whose mother picks up a gun and shoots her father in the kitchen one night has probably got something more going on than just voice. But voice is everything, particularly when it comes to memoir. I mean, that's it. I think maybe the best example I know of just, Mary, I think, has kind of some she really does have fireworks going on in her books, but I think This Boy's Life by Toby Wolfe is maybe a great example of memoir in that it really is just this boy's life. It's every boy's life. The ability to raise it from the personal to the universal is what great memoir is all about. And that is a book, I'd like to say that every year the 7th grade classes of all the private schools in New York City, I become famous because he actually thanks me in that book. And they're all, when my daughter was at school, grade school, every year I would have to go in 7th grade, would be ignited by This Boy's Life and talk to them about Toby and how he wrote this book. It's just, there aren't, it's magic. I don't know how some people do it, and other people can't get it out from under the water. That's the magic of great writing.
It's interesting, Binky, don't you think? Because voice, I think, is a huge driver of audience to certain books. And Patti Smith's book is so striking because we're used to her voice in a completely other context, music, and yet, the book was a fantastic success and, won the National Book Award for nonfiction. And she's such a natural writer. It's not really, her voice isn't that edgy. It's a very conversational voice. But I think it's just really exciting when a voice literally migrates from one medium to another, and it's even better than it was, I think. I just thought that book was like an amazing read, and that just about anybody would like it, I think.
Many great reporters are also not as great writers. Is that fair to say? So when you get a great reporter who also is a great writer, in this case, I'm thinking about Dexter Filkins, who wrote a book called The Forever War, which is just a book about war, sort of almost generically. That will be a book that will survive, I think, forever. Like, what's his name's book about Vietnam? I can't think
Michael
of.
Hare.
Yeah, like Michael Hare.
Dispatches.
Yeah, like Dispatches. And that too is just a gift. But gosh, the writing counts.
But memoir has got bad rap these days with certain scandals and with and this Mortensen thing is going to have an effect on memoir too. I wonder, Binky, if you think that publishers are going to scrutinize manuscripts a little bit more closely in terms of memoir, especially as being a suspect genre, factually suspect.
It's really hard. There aren't fact checkers at book publishing houses, and it's tricky, and the author is the expert. I mean, that's what you're buying when you buy that proposal or that manuscript. I think they do have lawyers that vet practically everything now, because nobody wants to get, because we're such a litigious society. So there's got to be probably more drilling down. I just think, but I mean, with it's hard to it's hard. I don't know. I mean, I think it's not just memoir. I think there's a lot floating around out there that's probably not entirely accurate. But it's not also like James Fry really set out to scam. I don't know. Do you think I read your Newsweek piece about Mortensen, just how I thought it was so interesting what you said about it used to take, in the days of just sheer print, it used to take weeks, sometimes months to bring somebody down. And now with technology, bang, minutes. They're dead in a minute. Give them a day.
Yeah, the cycle seems to have accelerated greatly.
And maybe that will produce scrutiny in and of itself. I mean,
it has. Think about
God,
Dan
you can get
Rather.
caught so easily.
Dan Rather was brought down at CBS on 60 Minutes too. If you remember the Bush, he had a lot of great reporting, and he nailed the fact that George W. Bush did not serve really in the military and got in through favoritism. But then they went through the second thing, which was they got to use the fraudulent document. The internet lit up, and people wrote in, and that's what CBS, after defending Rather, was forced to surrender and say, hey, we made a mistake. And the internet is really a check. I just want to say one thing about the memoir. About 7-8 years ago, I was a Pulitzer juror, and I was for nonfiction. And we probably got 600 books. My wife hated this experience because they all came to the house, literally 600 books. And including one with this guy said on the cover of it said, nominated for Pulitzer Prize. He wrote himself, nominated for Pulitzer Prize.
Nominated himself.
You almost didn't have to read that book, and actually you shouldn't have. It was really bad. But in any case, I would say half of the entries were memoirs. And one of the things that punched me in the nose going through that experience was good writing is and a voice, and as everyone says, is magic, and that's true. But it could also be skywriting, which disappears after a moment or two. If you don't have a universal story to tell, if you're not telling something larger than my life, there's a risk that it will perish. Right. And that's what I mean, the memoirs, most of them didn't make it for me as a juror because of that.
When blogs first started appearing, they were really praised as revelatory, groundbreaking. Obviously now, everyone and their 4-year-old has a blog, and it's tough to kind of sift through all the clutter. I wonder if you could talk a bit about some of the new platforms, whether it's Kindle singles, Atavist to a certain extent. There's always been sort of a stigma against self-publishing, and I wonder, what's the importance of a publisher as we move forward? Would Kindle singles, obviously, which is getting a lot of praise now, does that run the risk of getting to the point where everyone is posting something to Kindle singles and no one's really curating, no one's editing, no one's kind of putting their stamp on it?
Kindle singles actually aren't selling. It's not a form that seems to be working. Enhanced books aren't selling. Again, no one's buying them. So I don't know. I think the jury's a little out on that. So, I mean, I think curating, what you just said, is what's going to save the times, too. I mean, it's what's, people are going to pay for content online because there's too much stuff out there. And a lot of it can be...
But you want a gatekeeper.
You do want a gatekeeper. You want a curator. And you want to know, I mean, speaking to, is it true or false? That it's someone who does know what they're talking about, has reported it, or has some level of expertise, or is a scholar,
I think a big reason Byliner with the Krakauer piece was able to kind of get itself on the map revolved, though, around, there's nothing wrong with this, that the person who set up the site had a pre-existing relationship, and Krakauer is already an established name with a huge following of readers, and so it was the perfect first thing to launch with, and it's hard to have those stars align, I think.
I also think with the implosion of print media as we know it, there's a lot of really highly trained, great journalists and writers out there moving to other. Look who Tina Brown's hired at Daily Beast. At Bloomberg is the same thing. You're right. Huffington Post. People are now, there's like this great dissemination of talent going on, and it's kind of a reshuffling of the deck going on. This is not a bad thing, because as these people go out, they're going to raise the ante everywhere, and these are actually a lot of times older people too. What you're saying?
No. I didn't feel you were talking about me, darling.
No. But I think this is going to be good. I think it's going to ignite all sorts of. We're going to see good stuff come out of this.
The word curator prompts me to tell you a short anecdote. My second interview with Sergey Brin, who's the co-founder of Google, he rollerbladed into the meeting, which he often did. These are very strange people. And he comes in, he throws his knapsack on the table. He says, Ken, before you start drilling me, let me ask you a question. He said, why don't you publish this book on the internet for free rather than going to a publisher? I said, let me ask you a question. I said, if I do that, I said, who is going to pay me for 3 years, flying out, living in Silicon Valley a long period of time, plane fares, rent a car, hotels, paying for meal interviews with people? Oh. I said, who's going to edit my book? Oh. I said, who's going to do the promotion of my book? Oh. I said, who's going to do the index for my book? Oh. And we go down the list, and at that point he says, let me, that's okay. You saw your questions. It's okay. He didn't want to talk anymore. What did I learn from that? I learned two things. I learned that, A, he had an attitude that information should be free and make it all available, which Google has been forced to change that attitude. But he also was ignorant. He was naive. He didn't know anything about publishing. He's up here at 30,000 feet, and everything looks the same to him. And so one of the things we all have to do with these engineers is educate them to the real world. But it's just the importance of curation. Now, the question, which my wife is better equipped to answer than I am, is whether publishers will continue to provide that curation in the needed way with the deep editing and the book promotion tours and all that. But curation is essential.
I mean, Binky is definitely the resident expert, but the time some of you who read the book review may know, we started a couple of months ago publishing a bestseller list that includes ebooks. It's the first list now in the book review. And what's interesting to see over time is that mainly in the beginning when we started publishing it was dominated by the same big titles that were on the hardcover new books, hardcover list. But as time went on, some of these more self-published, not from conventional publishers, these books that were sort of phenoms in and of itself, we've had about 3 that have climbed up because it's, all
and then
books
they've gone on to
combined.
sell.
And that kind of caught my attention. Like, maybe that's a change. I don't know.
It's definitely changed. And then, but some of those people who were self-published have now gone on actually to get real publishers, because the thing with self-publishing is, it's great, but you got to promote it. You probably spend more time getting it because no one can find any of this stuff. So there you are with your book. You've self-published it, and then you spend. Well, you've spent years, but you do nothing then but try and get people to buy it, and that's it's hard. It also takes another kind of brain to do that, and a lot of writers. So many of these people self-published and spent a year getting notice. Then they immediately signed up with a publishing house, because the publishing houses are actually getting, thank God, finally, better and smarter about marketing online. they're kind of caught between, they've got the bricks and mortar business model they've got to support, and then they've got this new e-model that they've got to support. So at the same time, they still have the expense of all the warehousing and the sales forces and, the old model to bear, because that still represents 65-70% of their business. And then they're spending money like crazy hiring engineers and finding engineers who read. Engineers who've got two sides of their brain going is really kind of is hard, but there are kids coming out of school today, women too with computer science. I mean, this is great, who really want to go to work in book publishing. And that's another thing. We just have to, that's going to help a lot. And it's coming along. It's not coming along at a rapid clip, but it's definitely coming along. So that's another thing to be, as we migrate over, I think self-publishing will continue, but I think that the curated publishing will still be dominant.
I wanted to just respond to what Ken said, because I think in some ways that's the core of what we all face in the challenge of as writers, which is also similar again to what musicians and to what artists and actors have to contend with, and that is that the creative work is often so devalued by the audience that we're trying to reach that they actually think we should be donating it for free to the public as a general, just basically as a public service, and we can't afford to do that, and because it has a value. It takes a great deal of time to be able to do this, particularly narrative nonfiction. And it was so telling what you said, that it hadn't even occurred to this very brilliant person that it actually costs money for you to actually be there and to do the work that you're doing. And I think that it falls on all of us to educate everywhere we go as to why it's important for us to do it, and not to apologize for the fact that we need to be paid for the work that we're doing. Plumbers don't show up at your house for free and do whatever they do for free, and yet what we do takes years and years and years and is a great value and gives great enjoyment and enlightenment and all kinds of things to people. And I've actually been asked, why don't I just, I've been actually asked, I've gone someplace and said, well, just, why didn't you bring books to give to us? And I'm thinking, where do I begin? It was 15 years. And I think that we all have a task before us. Every one of us has a task before us of letting people know the value and not being apologetic for the fact that, yes, it has a cost. It's not free.
You know, I was sitting here making a list. You said, can we come up with 10 things to be optimistic about? Actually, I came up with a quick 14. And one of them is your point just triggered, which is there is a big change. It's a galactic shift that's taking place before our eyes. The Sergey Brins, those engineers in Silicon Valley who believe that everything should be free, and they were at war with traditional publishers who say you should charge. In fact, that world is coming much closer together, because what Google has realized and Apple has realized, look at the app world. You're paying for all of that. Yes. Look at YouTube. They're now charging for movies and for content like Netflix does. So increasingly, the engineering world, the digital world is saying we need curated content, professional content. And the publishing world is saying, you got to pay for it. And they're coming to an agreement. That's really one major thing. I don't have to bore you with the other 13, but there are lots of reasons to be optimistic. But that's a major one.
I want to ask about book reviewing, since book reviews are very important to whether a book gets on the map, so to speak. And there are, as we know, fewer and fewer venues. And I've done book reviewing, and it takes a lot of time, and to do a good book review is a big investment. So I'd like to hear about what's happening in print reviewing, and if there are any new online sites that are influential in reviewing.
Book reviews in general are an area of retreat at newspapers, certainly. There used to be, 10 or 15 years ago, probably a half dozen really excellent, influential, separate standing book reviews published. The LA Times had, a very good one. The Washington Post did. It's, pretty much down to the Times right now. It's just an interesting historical footnote that after Adolph Ochs purchased the Times more than 100 years ago, the very first extra thing beyond just the basic news report that he added to the Times was a book review. And the Times, through hell and high water, will continue to support, the book review, because we think it's a vital part of what the Times is, and it is not book advertising that is keeping the separate publication afloat. But it's in print, it's a shrinking market. I think there are some online reviews. I'm encouraged that, part of Rupert Murdoch's expansion of the Weekend Journal has included a Saturday section called The Review, which isn't exclusively book reviews, but is mostly book reviews. And I think it's smart. I also think of the Journal's news sections, it's the best looking of their news sections. So we have a nice new entrant. But it does worry me that in regional markets like the West Coast, even New England, that what were once vibrant book reviews have gone into retreat is another just sad part of the changes in the book marketplace overall.
But in its place, we've got a lot of more people reviewing books, like on Amazon. These guest, just the average person writes in, and I'm shocked and appalled by a lot of those reviews. But often I'm surprised at how very literate they are. It just sort of depends on. It's a grab bag, and you gotta sift through it. And I think it's a good thing that, I guess it's the democratization of reviewing, is that just any person who is a reader can now find a voice and express themselves. But you do have to sift through it a lot. I found that with my last book, Hellhound's Trail, which is about the Martin Luther King assassination, that most of the reviews were good and interesting, but there was this subset of reviews that were coming from the same person who just changed his name repeatedly, and it was a conspiracy thing. Mm-hmm. And I figured out who the guy was, because he's on various other websites reviewing the same book and saying the same thing about my book. So you have to read those. What do they call those things on Amazon? Like just the average reader reviews. You have to read them with a grain of salt, but there's amazingly a lot of good stuff out there as well.
There's also been a big rise in websites devoted to a fairly large topic that reviews books on a very regular basis. So one area that I've written in is the Civil War Memory website. Gets huge numbers of hits every day, and according to a couple sources, that website has produced near bestsellers just by favorable reviews and promoting it. It also functions as a kind of a blog. There are increasingly institutes whose function is outreach, that whose home is at a university or college, which will publish reviews. Those are other venues, all online, and the reviews tend to be longer, and people who are interested in that general subject will go to it, and it has a very loyal following, a loyal readership. That's been a big change that I've noticed in the past 3 years or so, 4 years.
It'd be great if we had an online Oprah.
Yes.
We some arbiters who, and I think that will probably happen. It just hasn't happened yet. You need that one person to kind of ignite that. Online book clubs, huge. And the publishers know how to get. One of the reasons book publishers are moving up the paperback editions of these books is because these book clubs are just ignite sales. It's kind of amazing. And it's that viral chatter. I mean, it's just the word of mouth has kind of almost made reviews obsolete in a way.
Other questions? Yes, in the front.
Can we please hear the other 13?
Ebooks, which save a lot of money for publishers if they can figure out a way to make money. And related to that is when Apple got into the ebook business, it gave publishers enormous leverage because they were dependent on Kindle and Amazon, which was producing 80% of all the ebooks. And Amazon was about to lower prices even more. And publishers were able to establish a price, to set their own price, when Apple got into the market. Now Google's in the market, and the Nook is in the market with Barnes & Noble. So publishers gained some leverage in that, and therefore authors gain some leverage, because the higher the price, the more the royalty for the author. Library at your fingertips, which Hampton mentioned here. Obviously, that changes all of our lives. Google Books, or the ability or Amazon to bring books that have been out of print back to life again, if the Google Book settlement is finally settled at some point. That's a really big deal. The growth of apps, and all these things we're talking about here are apps on your Kindle or whatever your device you have, but you're paying for it. And so the idea that you're paying for an online New York Times, or you're paying for Ada Vista, that's great. The fact that you can publish a book or a magazine and make it multimedia. I mean, I love when the New York Times does an obit. They did it first with Art Buchwald. And online it said, "Hi, I'm Art Buchwald, and I died today." And then they did a video interview. You did it with Sidney Lumet more recently, a couple of weeks ago. Ted Sorensen, yeah. But books will also have multimedia. You think about your iPad. Your iPad, unlike your Kindle, is something where you could click, you watch Ted Kennedy being interviewed on Charlie Rose as you're reading his book. Click, you watch him being interviewed on NPR. Click, you go to the New York Times archive. That is the multimedia dimension of this changes the nature of books in many ways and enlivens them. So that's another one. Old media, unlike what I said before, is leaning in. The Times putting its stuff online, and charging for it is just another example of that, and I think that's a healthy thing. We have, as writers, more platforms to write on. Whether we get paid the right amount is another thing, but we have more platforms in which to show off our work. It's more democratic, this world. Readers have a voice, and we could hear their voice, but also we don't have reporters in some place in the world, like in Tunisia, when that broke, or tsunamis. And suddenly people with their cell phones are our reporters. That is a fabulous democratization of information. That's great. Well, you don't necessarily need curation. It's two-way. Readers have a voice, and they can talk to us, and we can get ideas. We could also get the kind of criticism that you spoke of that is incredibly valuable. Also, two-way gives us an ability to get more ideas. We have people out there. Ken, have you ever thought writing an email or blogging or something? What about this as a story for the New Yorker? Obviously, the ability to blog and get your voice out quickly is a fabulous thing, and to build a following. John Krakauer, what is he doing? I mean, he's basically putting out something really fast. He has a following already. But as you said, Jill, I think part of the success of that and the viral nature of it was that it was John Krakauer. Links, you can write a piece and have friends, et cetera, link it, and suddenly it's a much more visible story you've written. And then the 14th point I wrote down for reason for optimism is the speed to publication. You can do a story, not just a shorter story, which you can publish almost overnight, but your books. You're not going to wait 9 months to a year from the time you finish the book till it's actually published.
I was thinking a little bit more about writing a memoir versus a book that is just more reported, even though there can be some reporting in memoir. And I was thinking about Amazon. If you go to Michelle Norris's book, it'll say, "With this by Ms. Wilkerson's book." And I was just wondering what kind of other questions go into whether you'll write a memoir or a piece more like The Warmth of Other Suns, because some topics you could do either. You know, you have some personal experience, you could have made yours very personal, and still, I think, universal in some ways because you're that good. So how do you... well, you would have made it universal in some ways. So what other questions go into that?
I think it depends on the project that you're working on, and I think all of the writers on the panel can speak to this, and I'd love to hear what everyone else has to say about this. The purpose of this was to be able to attempt to get a handle on and pull the reader inside the experiences of people who hadn't really been talked to in this way, and to look at it from a national perspective over the decades of this particular experience. I think each project demands different skills, techniques, and strategies for reaching the audience, connecting to the audience, and telling that story. And this was the way that I felt it needed to be told. As you know, I was racing against time with this particular one because these people were up in years anyway. So this was the last chance to get them at all. And so I felt that this was not the time for me to be examining myself or my own experience, but to get to them. So that was how that choice was made, and other people would make a different choice. That choice has consequences because this kind of reporting takes time. There's an occupational hazard when you're dealing with people of that age group where they get sick and worse, and that has to be dealt with. So it just depends on the project. I didn't know it was going to be 15 years. I didn't set out to do it 15 years. If I'd known it was 15 years, there would be no book. I will not spend that amount of time on any other single project. I can guarantee you that. And Vicki says good, with relief. But it's just a choice depending upon the project. And I would love to hear what everyone else thinks about that.
Well, I think it's also a question of how comfortable are you with your own voice. We were talking about voice being so important with memoir. I think someone like Isabel, who's a reporter, has spent a whole profession sort of going out into the world and reporting and looking outward, not looking inward. And I'm sure she has her own narrative voice if she wants to do a memoir, but I feel very uncomfortable when I'm doing a piece of reporting, introducing first person. There has to be a real good reason for it. There has to be some problem that's solved by bringing me into it. But another person, their personality is everything to do with it, like David Sedaris or something. You know, it's like whatever their personality is, and that voice that they maybe spent an entire career cultivating becomes central to the piece. So, like as you say, every project is different, every author is different, and for you, I think the question is just how comfortable are you with your voice and talking about yourself and shining a light on your inner life. It's something that each writer has to figure out.
But, just adding from the editor's point of view, I mean, the Times in general, we are very selective about when we encourage our reporters to do first-person accounts. And in the era when memoir took off like Topsy, it would have been very easy. And many, reporters on the Times, came to me with various first-person explorations. And, we tend to, as I said, be very selective, but when we do it, it's just immensely powerful. I'm thinking recently of when we had the 4 journalists captured and missing in Libya for days, Anthony Shadid, Steve Farrell, Tyler Hicks, and Lindsay Addario. They got, just the day that they were free, they got together and began putting together a piece that was a collective first-person account. I think there was tremendous value in that. Dexter Filkins, who was referred to earlier, just wrote a little piece that I believe it ran in Week in Review years ago. It was just about the experience it was before the Forever War came out. He wrote about the experience of running in Baghdad and how it had gotten more. It used to be something that he could do, when he began covering the war in 2003, and as civil war and the bloodiness of the situation there increased, he couldn't do it without this feeling that he was going to be killed running, and it was like a uniquely powerful thing that was specific, but obviously it was also universal. But I think medium matters too, that in the Times news report there's a certain awkwardness in interjecting too much first person accounts. But blogs, we have all kinds of blogs that are full of, really lively first person writing, and that's perfect, because in a blog, that's what you want. You want the immediacy, you want the voice. And even though it's awkward for many reporters, I spent my career mainly writing long investigative pieces, but, the whole blogging phenomenon really interested me. And for the first time in my life, I did a blog 2 years ago that was about just the relationship between human and dog and what the crazy first year of having a puppy is like. And it seems so trivial to me compared to all the other work I had done. I was almost embarrassed about it, but I have never gotten a response to anything I've written like that. It was this tidal wave of readers jumping in my face, wanting, liking my story, wanting me to hear theirs. I brought the whole Times website crashing down because I tried a thing where I invited people to send in photos of their dogs. And you can imagine, there were thousands of these submissions, and it literally brought our website crashing down for an hour, which was not a good thing to do. But sometimes just to get, that kind of immediacy in the writer-reader experience on the web, it's interesting to see how writing in the first person is a vehicle for that. So
I just wanted to ask a question circling back to what you were talking about, the importance of valuing our work as journalists. I'm a magazine journalist and a freelance writer. And I know that the rates for magazine writers have been stagnant for about, I haven't been doing it for 30 years, but I've heard it's been about 20 to 30 years. The per word rate really hasn't gone up much. I've heard from my friends in book publishing that advances are very hard to come by now and are very small. And I noticed that many of you on the panel are either in academia or have kind of old school journalism jobs that don't really exist for younger folks today. So I'm just wondering, when it comes to valuing our work, I'm not finding that publishers really value my work and are not really willing to pay for good magazine work. And I'm just wondering where you think that value is going to come from? Who's paying for it?
Well, I like Isabel sort of is laid out a kind of a paradox here, which is that we should value our work and know that it has value and not apologize for it. But she's also saying we should think of ourselves as musicians. And I'm thinking, I think of musicians out on the street, hoping someone will listen, buskers and all that sort of thing. I mean, it is, we are artists, and it is, I think we do have to be prepared for a long, tough slog in the early years. I know for me, I didn't make a real living at this until I was in my 30s. It was a joy at that time to I guess struggle and be poor, and I look back on those years with great fondness, even though I know it was a time of a lot of stress. And but I didn't have kids and I didn't have a lot of overhead, and I was willing to work for cheap. So I think that there's no question about it when we're, especially in journalism schools and this sort of thing. I don't think we can mislead younger folks into believing that it's going to be a real easy first few years or first 10 years. You have to do it because you love it.
It's not a high-paying profession. It's not Wall Street. It's never going to be Wall Street. So you have to do it because you love it, and you can still strike it rich. It happens. But there's so many authors that I've represented who were on. Cormac McCarthy never sold more than 2,500 copies, hardcover copies of any novel he wrote before all the pretty horses.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Ford, same thing. Toni Morrison was an editor at Random House to support herself. I mean, this is not, Jenny Egan just won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. She's never made a dime, really, beyond her advances. And the only good thing here was Visit from a Goon Squad came out in hardcover, didn't sell. We could not get arrested with that book. So we moved up the hardcover. We moved up the paperback publication date and then suddenly, just belatedly, the word of mouth started to happen. Reviews just kind of crept out of the wall from places that nobody expected. And, you know, we have the paperback in hand at a moment when she wins the Pulitzer Prize. We slap a sticker on that. I mean, she's going to finally make money. But this is
with HBO providing some gasoline.
I mean, right. We got a movie sale out of it, you know. But gosh, I will say I completely believe that the cream always rises to the top. That if you're good, you're going to make real money doing this. But you got to do it sometime for years and years. It's not easy.
Melville's most successful book was Type E, and after Oh Moo, he didn't make any money. And in fact, the last 20 years of his life, most critics and reviewers thought he'd already died. That's literally the degree of obscurity. I mean, Walt Whitman self-published his first edition of Leaves of Grass, and talk about a shameless self-promoter. Whitman wrote all these glowing reviews of his own book anonymously, and finally a publisher picks up the third edition, and finally by the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, he's actually making money at it.
Imagine if he had a blog.
I know. He's the
But Ben Franklin had a lot of good ideas at a day when a lot of people had a lot of good ideas. It's just that he also owned printing presses. Yeah. So every idea he had, he printed pamphlets, and so stay with it.
I think we'll allow Binky to have the last word on that. She said stay with it. And thank you so much for participating and joining in us. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you.